Have you ever wondered why two people can live through the same event yet walk away with two entirely different stories? One feels broken, the other feels at peace. Same world, same moment. So what changed? It wasn't the sky. It wasn't the people. It wasn't the chaos or the silence outside. It was the mind that met the world. Somewhere in the heart of the Himalayas, a young man once climbed for hours to reach a cave where a silent monk had lived alone for years. He asked the question that burned in his chest, "Master, how do I make this world less painful?" The old monk opened his eyes and replied with just one sentence, "When the mind is pure, the world is also pure." The student looked around. Nothing had changed. The winds were still cold, the rocks still rough, his backpack still heavy, but for the first time, he questioned the weight he carried inside. We often think of the world as something out there. A storm we must survive, a maze we must figure out, a battlefield where we either win or lose. But what if? The world is not what we see. It's how we see. What if the anger we feel isn't because people are cruel, but because we still hold a grudge? What if the loneliness doesn't come from an empty room, but from a mind that hasn't made peace with being alone? What if the noise outside is only unbearable because there's already so much noise within? In Buddhism, the world is not made of concrete and stone. It's made of perception. The Sanskrit word Vimalakirti means nothing but mental construction. Your thoughts are not just responses to the world. They are the paintbrush. And the world is the canvas. When your brush is dipped in fear, everything looks like a threat. When it's soaked in greed, nothing is ever enough. When it flows with peace, even the darkest nights shimmer with quiet beauty. There's a Zen saying, "A mountain is just a mountain until it is. Then it is again." At first, we see the world with innocent eyes. Then ego takes over, distorting everything. But through awakening, we return not to a different world, but to a different way of seeing. Imagine two people walking into the same forest. One sees beauty, the rustle of leaves, the dance of light on bark, the song of birds echoing through the trees. The other sees danger. Shadows that hide predators, paths that lead to nowhere, silence that feels like a trap. The forest hasn't changed. Only the mind has. A pure mind doesn't mean a mind without thoughts. It doesn't mean emptying yourself until there's nothing left. It means seeing things as they are, without the dust of craving, fear, or illusion. It's like looking into a mirror after cleaning the fog off. What's reflected isn't new, but for the first time, it's clear. The Vimalakirti Sutra tells the story of a layman, enlightened, wise, and silent amidst the noise of the world. When the gods ask, "Why is your house so cluttered, so chaotic, so impure?" he smiles and says, "To one whose mind is pure, even this is the pure land." And suddenly, those around him realize, it wasn't his house that needed fixing, it was their perception. The greatest shift doesn't come from running away to mountaintops. It comes from sitting still in the middle of your life and seeing it with different eyes. From reacting with fear, to responding with wisdom, from clinging tightly, to letting go gently, from blaming the world, to understanding the mirror. A monk was once asked, "How do I purify my mind?" He answered, "Look at your thoughts, greet them like travelers, but don't let them unpack. Let them come, let them go." And in the stillness between, the world begins to shimmer. We are trained to chase solutions outside, new places, new people, new possessions, but truth whispers something quieter and deeper. Change the lens and the landscape changes. Not because the world has transformed, but because you have. Right now, wherever you are, just pause, look around. It may be messy, noisy, unfair, chaotic, but it's not the world's condition that binds you. It's how much of your mind you've projected onto it. Maybe peace isn't found in a different place. Maybe peace is what you stop carrying, and maybe that's why the masters smile even in silence, why they walk slowly, speak gently, why their eyes seem to see something we don't. They are not in another world, they are in this world, but they carry nothing heavy within, and because their mind is pure, so is the world they walk in. The mirror is always waiting, not to show you the world, but to show you yourself. Wipe it clean, and watch how everything changes, not because life has been fixed, but because now finally, you're seeing it clearly. Let that settle, because there's more to uncover. What truly makes the world appear impure? And how do we unknowingly carry the dust that clouds our sight? Let's go deeper. There's a saying in the Dhammapada, all that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think, we become. But what if we take that even further? What if it's not just who we become, but what we see, how we feel, and the very shape of our world? You see, the mind doesn't just receive reality, it filters it, it colors it. It interprets every moment through a hidden lens, and that lens is karma. Now, karma isn't some invisible punishment system. It's not cosmic revenge or divine bookkeeping. Karma in its truest form means action, and more importantly, mental action. Every thought you've clung to, every emotion you've repeated, every belief you've reinforced, they all leave impressions, like fingerprints on the lens through which you see the world. Over time, those fingerprints become your filter, they become your story, and eventually they become your reality. Imagine this: two people wake up to a rainy day. One groans, everything goes wrong when it rains. The other smiles, perfect weather for tea and reflection. Same sky, same rain, but lifetimes apart in perception. It's not the clouds that shape your mood. It's the karma you carry. The unconscious stories, habits, and reactions built up over years, maybe lifetimes. There's a Tibetan analogy. The mind is like a crystal. If placed over red cloth, it appears red. Over blue cloth, it appears blue. But the crystal itself remains clear. That's your true nature, pure, luminous, untouched. But the karmic conditions around you have stained the cloth, and so you forget the clarity beneath. Karma is not just what happens to you. It's how you see what happens. It's the voice in your head that says, "I always get hurt." It's the fear that sees rejection in every silence. It's the craving that turns blessings into not enough. These are not just passing thoughts. They are grooves, deep, worn-in patterns that shape your vision like a river carves a canyon. And unless you see them clearly, they quietly rule your life. One day, a student asked the Buddha, "Why is there suffering?" He replied, "Because people cling to things that are impermanent, desire things that are out of reach, and resist what already is." And then he said something subtle, something most miss. What you see is a result of what you've planted. Your life is a garden of perception. If you've sown seeds of fear, the world will bloom with threats. If you've sown seeds of anger, the wind will always feel like resistance. But if you've watered the seeds of mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom, even pain becomes a teacher. Even sorrow becomes a sacred path. This is why the masters don't waste time trying to control the external world. It's endless. It's ever-shifting. Instead, they turn inward, to cleanse the lens, to untangle the habits, to see clearly again. Because once the lens is clear, even suffering becomes illuminated. A woman once visited a Zen monk and said, "I want to see the world differently. Teach me how to let go of pain." He served her tea, but instead of stopping, he kept pouring until the cup overflowed. Startled, she shouted, "Why are you still pouring?" He smiled, "Because your mind is like this cup, already full of old karma, old stories, old reactions. Until you empty it, nothing new can enter. The lens of karma isn't fixed. It can be cleansed, it can be softened, but only through awareness. Every time you pause before reacting, you rewrite a piece of karma. Every time you choose compassion over judgment, patience over anger, silence over ego, you polish the mirror. And little by little, the light begins to shine through. So the question isn't, why is the world this way? The question is, what lens am I looking through? And more importantly, am I willing to clean it? Because when you do, you begin to see life not as a battlefield to conquer, but as a field of reflection, offering you every moment the chance to wake up, in the silence between thoughts, in the space between craving and resistance. You catch a glimpse of something astonishing. The world has not changed, but your way of meeting it has. And in that shift, pain softens, clarity dawns, the chaos becomes dance. You can't always change what happens, but you can change how you meet it. That choice, made moment by moment, is karma, and through it you don't just shape the world, you awaken the one who sees. But let's not stop here, because if the lens is shaped by karma, then what does it mean to purify the mind? What exactly is a pure mind in Buddhism? Let's look deeper into the very heart of what purity truly means. What does it mean to have a pure mind? Is it a blank slate, an empty space, a saintly state where no thoughts arise, no emotions stir? Not quite. A pure mind isn't a mind without thoughts. It's a mind free from distortion. A mirror not cracked or stained, but still and clear. Reflecting the world as it truly is, without grasping, without pushing away. In Buddhism, purity isn't perfection. It's not about controlling your experience. It's about seeing through it. A pure mind doesn't mean you never feel anger. It means you see anger without becoming it. It doesn't mean you never get distracted. It means when distraction comes, you notice gently and return. The Buddha used a powerful metaphor. Imagine a bowl of water. If it's murky with mud, you can't see your reflection. But if it's still and clear, the moon, the stars, your own face appear without distortion. That still water is the pure mind, not blank, not empty, just undisturbed. So what muds the water? Greed, hatred, delusion. These are the three poisons, the roots of suffering. When they rise, the mind ripples, clouds, swirls. We grasp what we crave, resist what we hate, cling to illusions that aren't even real. And in that storm, we forget the sky above us was always open. There's a line in the Vimalakirti Sutra. The mind is like a painter. It paints the world with the colors of its own delusions. If the brush is dipped in attachment, we color our days with restlessness. If it's dipped in aversion, we paint our world with conflict. But if the brush rests in equanimity, suddenly the picture softens. Life becomes simple again, clear, sacred. A student once asked a Zen master, "How do I return to a pure state?" The master replied, "You don't return, you remove what never belonged." Because at its core, the mind is already pure. The problem isn't that you have to become something new. It's that you've forgotten what's already there. Think of it like this. You walk into a room filled with mirrors. Each one is covered in dust. You panic, thinking the world is gray, lifeless, dull. But in truth, it's the dust, not the mirror, that's hiding the light. Start wiping. Bit by bit, a reflection appears. Not a perfect one, but an honest one. A smile, a tear, the shape of your life exactly as it is. And for the first time, you see it without judgment. That is purity, not silence without thought, but silence within thought. Not a life without feeling, but a life where feeling doesn't turn into bondage. Not a denial of reality, but an embrace of reality, without distortion. So how does one live with a pure mind? Not by isolating, not by suppressing, but by learning to observe the mind with a calm, steady gaze. The great master Ajahn Chah once said, "You don't have to chase after your thoughts, just notice them. Smile at them and let them pass. And they will, like clouds across an open sky. You see, a pure mind is not cold. It's full of compassion. It sees pain and does not run. It sees joy and does not cling. It welcomes everything but holds onto nothing. And in that letting go, there is peace. A man once asked the Buddha, "Where is enlightenment found?" The Buddha replied, "Right here, in this body, this breath, this mind." But that mind must be seen without fog, without filter, without the heaviness of old stories. Only then can we know freedom. And the beautiful thing, purity doesn't need to be built. It just needs to be remembered. Right now, underneath all the noise, beneath the busy thoughts, the doubts, the fears, the craving, there is a mind as clear as the morning sky. It's been there the whole time, waiting. So breathe, let the thoughts come, let them go, let awareness remain. And know this stillness is not the absence of life. It is the essence of life. It's where truth lives, where freedom begins, where the world starts to shine. Not because it's been polished, but because your eyes have. And now, a question begins to rise. If purity isn't something added but revealed, then what happens when you meet the same world with that pure gaze? Can the painful world of samsara truly be transformed? Not by escape, but by insight. Let's follow that thread. What does it mean to have a pure mind? Is it a blank slate, an empty space, a saintly state where no thoughts arise, no emotions stir? Not quite. A pure mind isn't a mind without thoughts. It's a mind free from distortion. A mirror not cracked or stained, but still and clear, reflecting the world as it truly is, without grasping, without pushing away. In Buddhism, purity isn't perfection. It's not about controlling your experience. It's about seeing through it. A pure mind doesn't mean you never feel anger. It means you see anger without becoming it. It doesn't mean you never get distracted. It means when distraction comes, you notice gently and return. The Buddha used a powerful metaphor. Imagine a bowl of water. If it's murky with mud, you can't see your reflection, but if it's still and clear, the moon, the stars, your own face appear without distortion. That still water is the pure mind, not blank, not empty, just undisturbed. So what muds the water? Greed, hatred, delusion. These are the three poisons, the roots of suffering. When they rise, the mind ripples, clouds, swirls. We grasp what we crave, resist what we hate, cling to illusions that aren't even real. And in that storm, we forget the sky above us was always open. There's a line in the Vimalakirti Sutra. The mind is like a painter. It paints the world with the colors of its own delusions. If the brush is dipped in attachment, we color our days with restlessness. If it's dipped in aversion, we paint our world with conflict. But if the brush rests in equanimity, suddenly the picture softens. Life becomes simple again, clear, sacred. A student once asked a Zen master, "How do I return to a pure state?" The master replied, "You don't return, you remove what never belonged." Because at its core, the mind is already pure. The problem isn't that you have to become something new. It's that you've forgotten what's already there. Think of it like this. You walk into a room filled with mirrors. Each one is covered in dust. You panic, thinking the world is gray, lifeless, dull. But in truth, it's the dust, not the mirror, that's hiding the light. Start wiping. Bit by bit, a reflection appears. Not a perfect one, but an honest one. A smile, a tear, the shape of your life exactly as it is. And for the first time, you see it without judgment. That is purity, not silence without thought, but silence within thought. Not a life without feeling, but a life where feeling doesn't turn into bondage. Not a denial of reality, but an embrace of reality, without distortion. So how does one live with a pure mind? Not by isolating, not by suppressing, but by learning to observe the mind with a calm, steady gaze. The great master Ajahn Chah once said, "You don't have to chase after your thoughts, just notice them, smile at them, and let them pass. And they will, like clouds across an open sky. You see, a pure mind is not cold. It's full of compassion. It sees pain and does not run. It sees joy and does not cling. It welcomes everything but holds onto nothing. And in that letting go, there is peace." A man once asked the Buddha, "Where is enlightenment found?" The Buddha replied, "Right here, in this body, this breath, this mind. But that mind must be seen without fog, without filter, without the heaviness of old stories. Only then can we know freedom. And the beautiful thing, purity doesn't need to be built. It just needs to be remembered. Right now, underneath all the noise, beneath the busy thoughts, the doubts, the fears, the craving, there is a mind as clear as the morning sky. It's been there the whole time, waiting. So breathe, let the thoughts come, let them go, let awareness remain. And know this stillness is not the absence of life. It is the essence of life. It's where truth lives, where freedom begins, where the world starts to shine. Not because it's been polished, but because your eyes have. And now, a question begins to rise. If purity isn't something added but revealed, then what happens when you meet the same world with that pure gaze? Can the painful world of samsara truly be transformed? Not by escape but by insight. Let's follow that thread. There's a story told in ancient Buddhist texts. A man walks through the forest at dusk. As he turns the corner, he suddenly freezes. A venomous snake lies in his path. His heart races. His breath shortens. He jumps back in fear. But as the light shifts, he looks again. It wasn't a snake, it was just a rope. Nothing changed except his perception. And with that, his fear vanished into thin air. We don't live in the world as it is. We live in the world as we perceive it to be. Our minds are not cameras. They are projectors. We don't just take in reality, we cast meaning onto it. A word becomes an insult. A silence becomes rejection. A shadow becomes danger. And most of the time, we're not reacting to the world. We're reacting to the stories in our heads. In Buddhism, this is called vainaptimatra. Nothing but mental construction. What you experience is not the thing itself, but your mind's interpretation of it. Perception is not truth. It's a conditioned lens, shaped by memory, belief, fear, and desire. You think you're seeing the world clearly. Look again. You're seeing through the lens of every story you've ever believed. The child who was ignored now sees neglect in every delay. The lover who was betrayed now suspects every smile. The soul who was wounded walks through life expecting pain. Not because the world is cruel, but because the mind has not yet healed. This is why the Buddha didn't just teach morality or meditation. He taught us to examine perception itself. Because if you can't see clearly, you'll mistake a rope for a snake and live your life in unnecessary fear. The 5 skandhas, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, describe how we construct our sense of reality. Perception, samjna, is the middle link, the one that colors what we feel and what we believe. And once colored, we react, we suffer, we get trapped in the illusion we ourselves created. There's a Zen proverb, don't draw the line with your eyes. Draw it with your heart. Because your eyes can lie. They'll show you only what your mind is conditioned to see. But the heart, when pure, when present, can see beyond illusion. Think of the moon reflecting on a pond. If the water is stirred, the moon appears broken, trembling. But the moon was never broken. It was just the water, just perception. That made it seem that way. Our relationships, our fears, our hopes, they're all reflections on the surface of our awareness, distorted by ripples of assumption, clouded by past pain, but beneath it all, the moon still shines. There's a beautiful teaching in the Lankavatara Sutra. Things are not what they seem. nor are they otherwise. It's a poetic way of saying, the world is real, but the way we grasp it is, we confuse appearance with essence. We take temporary ripples and turn them into permanent truths, and in that confusion we suffer. But here's the good news: you can train perception. You can refine how you see, not by changing the world, but by meeting it with stillness, curiosity, and awareness. Next time anger rises, pause. Before the story forms, look deeper. What are you really reacting to? A tone, a word, a memory? Trace it back, and often you'll find you're not upset because of what happened. You're upset because of what it meant to you. And meaning is perception. The ancient masters didn't seek to control the world. They sought to understand their own projections. Because once you see through illusion, you stop living in fear of shadows. You stop grasping at mirages. You stop fighting battles that were never really there. You begin to live with open eyes. In the Diamond Sutra, the Buddha says, as a star, a bubble, a lamp, a phantom, a dewdrop, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, so should one view all conditioned things, not with despair, but with humility, with the quiet understanding that reality is fluid, fleeting, and far more spacious than our minds suggest. This doesn't mean life is meaningless. It means life is not fixed. Your pain isn't permanent. Your judgments aren't facts. Your fears are not prophecies. They're passing clouds across the sky of awareness. Let them pass, and what remains is clarity. So what world are you living in? One filled with snakes, or ropes you've mistaken for them? Are you caught in reactions, or resting in presence? Because the way you see will shape the way you live, not just today, but every day. And now we arrive at a crossroads. If the world is made of perception, and perception is shaped by karma, memory, and mind, then what happens when that mind becomes truly still? Can we walk through the marketplace, the noise, the chaos, and still be at peace? Let's turn to a voice from ancient times, a silent sage whose clarity pierced through the illusion of form and chaos. Let's step into the world of Vimalakirti. In a bustling city, not in a remote cave or mountain hermitage, there lived a layman, a householder named Vimalakirti. He wore no robes, he took no vows, he held no title. But when the Buddha asked his disciples to visit this ailing man, each one hesitated, not out of disrespect, but because they knew this was no ordinary man. Vimalakirti spoke with thunderous silence. He shattered illusions with stillness, and he taught what few dared to say aloud. That enlightenment is not confined to temples, and the Pure Land is not somewhere else. It begins right here in the clarity of mind. We often imagine the Pure Land as a heavenly realm, a paradise far from our suffering, a place free from noise, pain, and decay. But Vimalakirti flips the script. In the Sutra he declares, when the mind is pure, the land is pure. The implication is radical. You don't have to escape the world. You have to transform the way you see it. A crowded city becomes sacred. When you look through the eyes of compassion, a dying body becomes holy. When touched by mindful presence, even suffering, when understood deeply, can become the doorway to awakening. This is the Vimalakirti vision, a dharma not of escape but of penetration, not running from the world, but realizing its true nature. The sutra speaks of bodhisattvas who dwell in hell, not to suffer, but to liberate. They don't reject impurity, they see through it. They don't cling to comfort, they lean into chaos, armed only with compassion. Why? Because they know the so-called impure world is just a projection of the impure mind. So what is a pure mind? It's not sterile. It's not blind positivity. It's not some fantasy of perfection. A pure mind is one that doesn't cling, doesn't resist, doesn't distort reality with greed, hatred, or delusion. It sees things as they are. and responds with wisdom and love. That's the real miracle, not walking on water, but walking through daily life without falling into reactivity. There's a scene in the Sutra that feels almost surreal. The Buddha from another land sends a flower, a lotus, from his own pure land. But when the disciples try to pick it up, they can't. Only Vimalakirti's non-dual understanding allows him to receive it. This isn't just symbolism, it's a teaching. You can't grasp the reality of the Pure Land if you're still trapped in binary thinking. Pure versus impure, sacred V's. Mundane me versus them, because division is the first illusion. Wherever there is other, there is misunderstanding. But when the mind rests in unity, in suchness, then every place becomes a pure land. Vimalakirti even mocks the idea of spiritual superiority. He shows that even monks, with all their training, can still be trapped by concepts, because enlightenment isn't about what you wear or how much you renounce. It's about how you see. A pure robe doesn't mean a pure mind. A loud chant doesn't mean a silent heart. He also teaches through silence. When asked the nature of non-duality, Vimalakirti says nothing, just silence. And in that silence, the entire assembly is struck with awe. Why? Because words divide, concepts cling. But truth is lived, felt, embodied. And when you rest in that direct knowing, without trying to grasp it, you enter the Pure Land. Not somewhere else, but here, now. Vimalakirti's life was a living koan, wealthy yet detached, in the world yet not of it. He moved through the marketplace with a monk's serenity. He served his sick body without self-pity. He turned daily life into dharma, and in doing so, he challenged the very foundations of spiritual hierarchy. He showed that awakening is not about separation, but integration. So let me ask you, what if your impure world, your traffic, your stress, your noise, wasn't the problem? What if it was the very path? What if your home, your workplace, your messy kitchen was your pure land in disguise, all waiting for one thing, the purity of your perception? And if the Pure Land isn't a place, but a state of mind, then the question becomes, what are you cultivating inside? Because the world you walk through is painted by the colors of your mind. Clarity brings light. Compassion brings warmth. Stillness reveals truth. And in that, everything becomes sacred. So the next time you look at the world, ask not, why is it so messy? Ask instead, what part of me is still clinging, still judging, still dividing? Because when those parts fall away, you'll find you're not waiting to enter the Pure Land. You've been standing in it all along, and now a deeper dive awaits. If perception shapes our world, and the Pure Land is here when the mind is pure, then how do we work with the forces that cloud that purity? Let's explore the roots. Let's shine the light on Mara, the force of illusion, temptation, and distraction, not as a demon outside, but as patterns inside. There's a story in Zen about a monk who asked his master, "Master, what is the way?" The master replied, "Your everyday mind is the way." The monk asked, "Then should I try to follow it?" The master said, "If you try to follow it, you go astray." That's the paradox of Zen. It doesn't offer you a path to get somewhere. It strips away the illusion that there's any other place to be. Seeing clearly isn't about changing the world. It's about removing the fog between you and reality. No embellishments, no commentary, just this as it is. When Zen speaks of clarity, it doesn't mean clarity of concepts or opinions. It means seeing without filters, without your past, without your fears, without your ambitions distorting what is right in front of you. Zen is ruthless in its simplicity. If your house is on fire, don't write a poem about it, pick up the water. One of the most powerful Zen teachings is this: before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The world doesn't change. You do. Suddenly, the ordinary becomes radiant. The act of folding clothes becomes a dance of attention. Washing a dish becomes a sermon in silence. Walking becomes a prayer without words. But to reach that simplicity, Zen asks you to let go of everything you think you know. Not add more layers of philosophy, but peel them away. Not reach for the heavens, but plant both feet firmly in the earth. A Zen master might shout at you, strike you with a stick, answer your question with a rock or a silence or a laugh. Not to confuse you, but to crack your addiction to mental frameworks. Because when the mind is full of thoughts, you're not seeing life. You're seeing your commentary on life. A clear mind is like a still pond. When the surface is undisturbed, it reflects the moon perfectly. But the moment desire stirs, the surface ripples, and what you see is distorted. Zen invites you to sit in that stillness, not to escape the world, but to let the world reveal itself, without distortion. There's a koan that says, "The flag is flapping in the wind," said one monk. "No," said another, "the wind is moving." The master replied, "It is neither the wind nor the flag. It is your mind that is moving." That is Zen, not solving the mystery, but stepping back and realizing you are the one creating it. When the mind stops chasing explanations, truth appears, not in words, not in logic, but in the undeniable reality of this moment. Zen doesn't promise perfection, it offers presence. It doesn't teach escape, it teaches immersion. Total, open, fearless immersion in what's happening right now. To drink tea, and only drink tea. To listen to the wind, and not name it, not judge it, just hear. To look at someone's face, and not project onto it your expectations or memories, but actually see them. In this way, Zen clears the lens of perception, not by polishing it, but by removing it altogether. Because any lens, no matter how beautiful, distorts, and what you're truly looking for is not more insight, but less interference. The Zen masters often say, don't seek the truth, only cease to cherish opinions. Your opinions are like dust on a mirror. You keep trying to polish the world, but it's your mirror that needs cleaning. And once it's clean, you'll see the world was never broken. Only the way you looked at it was. So how do you begin? You don't. You return to breath, to silence, to chopping wood, to carrying water, to the simplicity that was always there, waiting for you to stop looking elsewhere. And perhaps that's the greatest gift of Zen, not giving you new answers, but helping you fall in love with the question itself, not taking you away from the world, but helping you see that this very world, with all its noise and mess and mystery, was sacred all along. But what happens when even Zen feels hard to grasp? When thoughts still invade and clarity feels far? Sometimes, even with all your practice, the shadows return: doubt, fear, confusion. What do you do then? You don't fight them. You meet them. You meet the Mara within. We often think enlightenment is some distant peak, reserved for monks in caves, for saints in scriptures, for people holier than us. But the truth, enlightenment begins with how you wash your hands, with how you respond when someone interrupts you, with how you breathe when you're stuck in traffic. Purity of mind is not a one-time achievement. It's a path, walked step by step, moment by moment, habit by habit. The good news: you don't need to move to the mountains. You don't need to shave your head or change your name. You just need to be willing to meet your own mind honestly and return again and again to awareness. So how do you cultivate a pure mind? Not by forcing purity, but by clearing what clouds it, like a muddy river settling into clarity. When the stirring stops, the first step is always the same: attention. Where is your attention right now? Not your body, not your to-do list, not your goals 5 years from now, but this breath, this thought, this flicker of emotion passing through. The Buddha didn't teach escape, he taught presence. The breath, the body, the feeling, they are your gateway. Even brushing your teeth can be a sacred act, if you're truly there for it. But if your body is brushing and your mind is in yesterday's argument, you're not really living that moment. You're missing it, and the mind that misses the moment cannot be pure. Because it's divided, everyday practice means returning to wholeness, even in small things, waking up and taking a full breath, sitting down without picking up your phone, drinking tea without checking the time. These aren't minor acts. They are training the mind to be undistracted, training the heart to be undivided. And when distractions come, and they will, you don't fight them like enemies. You bow to them like teachers, because even anger, even fear, can reveal where the mind still clings. Even a restless thought is a Dharma gate, if you're willing to meet it with awareness. One of the most underestimated tools on this path is consistency. You don't need to meditate for hours. You just need to show up. Even 10 mindful breaths, taken with sincerity, can change the entire texture of your day. But skip it for too long, and the dust returns, not because the world got dirtier, but because the mirror of your mind lost its shine. And so we polish it gently, with silence, with stillness, with kindness. And yes, kindness is part of this path too. You can't cultivate a pure mind while feeding it poison, judgment, self-loathing, blame, so speak gently to others and to yourself. When you make a mistake, don't scold yourself like a failure. Smile like a gardener who knows. We'll try again tomorrow. That's daily practice, not perfection, but the quiet returning, the willingness to pause, the courage to face the messy, raw, real landscape of your own heart, and still choose love over reaction, still choose breath over impulse, still choose presence over distraction. It's easy to believe the world needs changing, but the one who sees the world, that's who needs refining, not because you are broken, but because the mind, left untrained, will always distort the view. And no matter how much beauty surrounds you, if the lens is dirty, you won't see it. The goal isn't to avoid the world. It's to walk through it with a mind that doesn't cling, to hear harsh words and not carry them, to feel sadness without drowning in it, to touch joy without becoming greedy for more. This is the work of a lifetime, and also the work of this very moment, right here, right now. Because a pure mind isn't built on grand gestures, it's built on small choices. The choice to pause, to breathe, to notice, to return, again and again. And eventually, you realize there is no later where the pure mind will begin. There is only this breath, this step, this sacred now. The world hasn't changed. It's still full of broken systems, unpredictable people, and days that don't go as planned. The headlines still scream, the traffic still jams, the dishes still pile up in the sink. And yet, something's different now, because you've stopped waiting for the world to be calm. Before you can be, you've stopped believing. That peace lives outside of you. You've turned inward. You've polished the mirror. You've begun to see with clarity. And in that clarity, even the mess becomes sacred. Living with a pure mind doesn't mean the world stops being difficult. It means you're no longer defined by its difficulty. The noise outside may rise, but the storm inside has quieted. You've stopped reacting, started responding, not from fear, not from pride, but from stillness. The angry person doesn't shake you. You see their suffering and meet it with space. The failure doesn't define you. You see it as a teacher, not a verdict. Even your own emotions, sadness, jealousy, restlessness, you no longer push them away or pretend they aren't there. You sit with them like old friends, and they pass. Because all things do. The pure mind doesn't cling. It doesn't grasp at what's pleasant. or reject what's painful. It flows like water, flexible, clear, unstoppable. And when you begin to live this way, something else shifts. You no longer see others as enemies. You see them as reflections. Every difficult person is a mirror, showing you where your patience ends and where your compassion begins. Every kind act you offer is not just for them. It nourishes you. Because in this new vision, there is no separation. A pure mind doesn't divide the world into me and them. It sees one field, one breath, one great unfolding. Yes, people will still lie. Yes, life will still hurt sometimes. But your suffering won't deepen unnecessarily, because suffering, too, is shaped by how you hold it, and the pure mind holds it. Gently, you begin to live differently, not because someone told you to, not because you're following rules, but because it just makes sense. You consume less, speak more slowly, listen more deeply. You no longer rush through life as if joy were hiding around the next corner. You find it right here, in the laughter of a child, in the silence after rain, in the moment you forgive someone without needing them to apologize. And even in tragedy, you don't collapse, not because you've become numb, but because you've become open. You don't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You carry it in your heart. And the heart, when it's vast enough, can hold everything. Living with a pure mind in a messy world isn't about becoming a saint. It's about becoming honest. Honest with what you feel, honest with what you need, honest with how you contribute to the chaos, and how you can choose differently. It's about meeting life with clarity instead of control, and that's when the real magic happens. You stop trying to purify the world and realize the world was never impure, only the lens was clouded. This is not an escape. This is a return to presence, to compassion, to truth. The world may still be messy, but now you walk through it with clean feet, with open eyes, with a heart that doesn't close, just because the world forgot how to love. So when the noise rises again, when chaos knocks on your door, you know what to do. You don't need to run. You don't need to numb out. You don't even need to fix it. You breathe. You see clearly. You respond wisely, because this is the gift of a pure mind. Not a life without difficulty, but a life of deep clarity within it. And from here, there's one final thing to understand. The world you see now is no longer something separate from you. Because when the mind is pure, the world is also pure. And in our final chapter, we arrive at this truth in full circle, not as an idea, but as a realization that changes everything. Let's pause not to end, but to truly see where we've arrived. After everything we've explored, after every layer peeled back, what remains? A single truth, simple and profound. You are not separate from the world you see. All along, the pain you noticed out there was echoing your inner unrest. The beauty you glimpsed was the purity of your own heart, shining through the cracks and the chaos. The confusion, the noise, the anger was never just the world's burden to carry. It was yours too, and now you've begun to lay it down. There's a moment in deep meditation, perhaps you've felt it, where the boundary between you and everything else melts. You are no longer observing the breath. You are the breath. You are no longer watching the wind move the trees. You are the wind. You are the trees. There is no longer you sitting on the cushion and life happening out there. There is just this. This is not mysticism. It's not philosophy. It's reality. Once the fog of ego lifts, you don't disappear. You become more fully yourself. But the self you thought you were, the anxious, defensive, never enough self, fades into something deeper, something still, something vast. You are the world, not metaphorically, but intimately. The joy you withhold from others is the joy you deny yourself. The love you extend is the love that heals you. The clarity you bring to your own mind is the clarity that lights up the world around you. This is not poetic wishful thinking, it's Dharma. It's how things are when the mind is pure. The world is also pure, because the world has always been seen through you. And now that you see clearly, what do you see? Not perfection, not a utopia, but something even more precious, reality as it is, unfiltered, unclung to, unclouded. Even sorrow now holds beauty. Even impermanence feels like a gift. You no longer need life to be easy. You need it to be real. And it is. You've returned to the world, not as a separate self trying to survive it, but as a conscious presence, meeting life with an open heart and steady gaze. So let the noise rise, let the world turn, let people change, and seasons pass, and things not go as planned. You found the eye in the storm, the clarity in the chaos, the still point within movement. You are not above the world, you are not beneath it. You are of it, part of the wave, part of the sky, part of the sacred whole. No more chasing peace, no more fixing what was never broken, no more waiting to be enough. Right here, in this breath, you are already what you've been seeking. So bow to the world, not as a battlefield, but as your teacher. Bow to your thoughts not as enemies, but as passing clouds. Bow to your life not as a burden, but as your practice, and walk forward, light present awake. Because now you understand, a pure mind doesn't change the world, it reveals the world as it has always been. This is not the end. This is where you begin living, with eyes unclouded and a heart wide open. And wherever you go, you carry the pure land with you, because it was never a place, it was always you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for seeing the world with new eyes.